do it anyway.
Baruchem Aboim B'Shem Hashem. B'Shem Irgin Shirter, I'd like to welcome everyone to today's shir from our Rabbi Yakov Shlita on Nishlach of Eischolim B'Shabbos Yomtov, being discharged from a hospital on Shabbos Yomtov. I was great sponsoring a shir called Irgin Shirter 718-851-8651 or email ist@yeshivanet.com. Harav Smith.
We often say that the best shiurim are the ones that really happened. And this morning's sugi really is a few shals that I heard. At the time I wasn't clear exactly what to do, so I wanted to look into the sugya. One of our neighbors had a very severe kidney stone attack, and they rushed to the hospital on Shabbos. And Baruch Hashem, when they got there, basically the kidney stone had passed, and it was out of danger. And now it was still many hours left to Shabbos. What's the halachic? Can they go back with a car service, with a guy? Do they have to stay the whole Shabbos? You know, here in the city, you know, in a Brooklyn hospital, there's Bika Cholim, it's Shabbos friendly, but let's say in the mountains we have the Shaila. A person is rushed from a bungalow or from a camp to the hospital, and Baruch Hashem, they're discharged. Now what? You know, could be, it's very difficult to stay in the hospital the whole Shabbos. Not every hospital is like the wonderful Bika Cholim centers that we see today. Very often it's Chutz L'Tchum. What do you do if it's Chutz L'Tchum? We just had a shayla. Someone had very severe chest pains, and he thought maybe he's having a heart attack. Then he called Hatzolah, and they rushed to the hospital. And he was diagnosed, basically, his problem was indigestion, also known as too much cholent. So he went from a pekuach nefesh to a excess of cholent. But he's not a chayla. Now, does he have to spend the rest of Shabbos in the hospital? It's unreasonable. You let him mechal Shabbos because he came beheta. So the question is, first of all, when could a guy be called to drive him home? What's the halacha if it's out of the tchum? And don't forget, even to Staten Island can be out of the tchum. So there are two questions we have to deal with. First of all, going home by car, Gaisha car service, and chutz the tchum. There are also two people involved. The ex-chayla, who had the possible heart attack, or sometimes you have a yoledis that runs to the hospital and it's a false alarm, false labor. So the ex-patient, and the question is the one that was malava them, the one that escorted them. The husband went along with the wife, the son went with the parents. It's negay for Shabbos and Yomtov, so you have 52 Shabbos, 13 days of Yomtov. It's a very common shayla. And also we have to discuss what can be done with the person's belongings. They came with a suitcase, thinking they're going to spend the next few days there, and they're discharged before they even were admitted. So one thing I think is very clear, that the fact that they went beheter or went b'mitzvah, the Rav says you must go to the hospital. I don't know, you have chest pains, who knows what it is. They went b'mitzvah, but that's not a heta to go back. You know, there's no round trip heta. You went al pikuach nefesh, okay. Baruch Hashem, you were discharged. Now we have another shayla. And what makes it much more challenging, I think I can say, since the world was created, there was no greater chilul Shabbos than going by car. The driving of a car is probably the biggest chilul Shabbos known to mankind. Now, if you understand how cars work, you don't need me to explain it. If you don't, it's not going to help me explaining it. But very basically, the car works on the gas and sparks that causes explosions, combustions. Now, to make a very long story short, the car is driven by those explosions which are real, McCoy, Havara, Daraisa. Between 4,000 and 8,000 Havaris explosions per minute. So that's a pretty serious Chilul Shabbos. Besides the bishul of the oil and the antifreeze, but driving a car is probably the most unbelievable Chilul Shabbos, again, known to mankind. Now, whether you understand that or not, but I'm telling you, driving a car, whether a yid or a goy, Amir La'akum, is the most serious Chilul Shabbos known to mankind. Now, the emphasis with the electric cars, it's a lot easier. because at most only the use of electricity, which some say is the Rabbanon, and some already have been suggesting Hatzolah members should have, if it's possible, to have an electric car. You reduce the Chilul Shabbos drastically. But right now, the car service, as of now, do not have electric cars, and it's talking about calling a guy to do multiple Chilul Shabbos. So all we need for today, we have to just do a little basic review of the basic klalim of Amir La'akum. And then hopefully we can apply it to the many shilas. So I think first and foremost, we have to know the chaymer of Amir La'akum. Like a Rav once told me, people think that Amir La'akum is not just a heta, it's a way of life. Have the guy do it. It's not a heta, it's not a way of life. To quote the Tshuvas Min HaShamayim in Siman Dal, one of the Rishonim, he asked Min HaShamayim about a certain situation, if you can be Mata Amir La'akum. So the response was, Laisige Bayod, Kisakal Yisakal, Ayara Yara, Kol Nageya B'Dvreyim, if you play around with Amir La'akum, K'Nageya B'Bavas Einai, you're playing with the Bernstein's pupil, Kaviyachot Bernstein's eye. Uvekama V'Kaimas Asu Chachamim Chizlik Dvreyim, Yoisim Mishal Torah. In other words, it's not a heta, it's not a way of life, it's very chamor. So step number one, Amir La'akum is chamor. But step number two is equally important, and that is the chumrah of b'chai b'hem, of maintaining well health. The Shulchan Aruch and Shin Chav Ches Sif Yud Zayin speaks about a chayla she'ein by sakana. Don't forget, there's no potential pekuach nefesh, but he's sick, he's bedridden, he has a flu, he has fever, whatever it is. It's not sakanas tefashis. Or he is chala kol aguf, and he has to get into bed, he's just very weak. So the halacha is he's allowed to have a guy do even a malacha deraisa for him. As I state in Mishnah, I feel a malacha deraisa, he could have a guy do malacha for him, even though it's not pekuach nefesh. But Chazal wa matir Amir La'akum cross the board. To give an example, the Shulchan Aruch early in Reishai involved Sif Hay. I guess this is a winter shaila, but let's say the steam is not working, the fire is not on, the heat is not on, and right now they're okay, and the people are okay, but it starts to get colder and colder, and it might cause them to get sick. So you're allowed to call a guy and light the fire, make havara deraisa. Mishnah Berurah spells out in Sifkat and Mem, you're allowed to tell him the favors. You don't have to hint with him, because very often hinting turns into a chil Hashem. He doesn't know what you mean, what you want, what do you want from me. If you have a chayla she'ein by sakana even, the guy can be asked to do directly a malacha deraisa. That's even when there's a concern, it might become a chayla she'ein by sakana, yesh by sakana, like the case of the heating. Now, here's the question. Our discharged patient, ex-patient we'll call him, is not chayla. He has too much shalom, it's not a chayla. So why should it be mutter? And especially if his house is chutz l'tchum, so now it's not the guy's doing a malacha, he's doing a malacha, he's going chutz l'tchum. Now, again, the fact that he went beheta does not impact the sugya. But we see one more prat, and that is basically, sometimes even a yid's allowed to do malacha. And this is the Shulchan Aruch and Shin Chav Ches Sif Yud Zayin, the same place, that if a person is a chayla she'ein by sakana, I'll give you a good example, he's in the hospital, he's recuperating, he's okay, he's out of danger, but he's still a chayla. And there's no one available to press the call button to call the nurse, he needs the nurse. So if he's a chayla she'ein by sakana, he's allowed to do a malacha d'Rabbanan by himself with a shinui. So obviously it's a combination. He's a chayla, he's only doing an issa d'Rabbanan at most, and that d'Rabbanan is a shinui. So it's like a double heta b'makam chayla she'ein by sakana. That's by chayla she'ein by sakana. Again, if he presses the button with a shinui, so he's doing an issa d'Rabbanan with a shinui, that's mutter. Even a yid to do it. But the Shulchan Aruch adds, but if there's hakanas aver, let's say a person broke his foot, and if it's not treated, it won't heal properly, and he'll have to limp, he won't be able to have full use of his leg, then the yid's allowed to do an issa d'Rabbanan without a shinui. And we'll soon see how extremely important this is. But we paskin basically, a yid could do an issa d'Rabbanan with a shinui, and if there's hakanas aver, someone has a problem with his eye, if he doesn't take care of it, it's going to get worse, then he could even do an issa d'Rabbanan by himself. He could pick up the phone, and call a goyish car service and take him to the hospital. So again, the chaymer of Amir La'akam is true, but then again, the chaymer of Pikuach Nefesh is also true. So I'll give you one simple contrast for now, and then we'll apply this more specifically. If someone is a chayil she'ein b'sakana, let's say it's not just that he had indigestion. He's like a very shvach. He thought he was having a heart attack, but he's still a chayil she'ein b'sakana. So what he could do is he could have a guy call a car service, and he goes to the hospital with the car service, goyish car service. He's doing thousands and thousands of the guy is doing thousands and thousands of havara. It's not your problem. Chayil she'ein b'sakana, Amir La'akam is mutter across the board. But for him to pick up the phone and call the car service himself, that's a problem, because he's doing an istabanan biyadayim. So the only have to be if he does it with a shinoi. Or, I'll give you another mashal, if a person has to go to a hospital, and he goes to and it's chutz l'tchum, so you have to be sure that there's a heta for that. Because if it's just a chayil she'ein b'sakana, then what's the heta to go chutz l'tchum? Because chutz l'tchum, a yid going chutz l'tchum is worse than a guy driving and doing thousands of isurei Torah. Because here it's the yid doing, and there it's a guy doing. Okay. Now let us apply it, and we'll try to organize this in a way we can retain it. We're talking now when it's not a problem of chutz l'tchum. We're talking about going to a hospital here in Brooklyn. The problem is not the tchum. The problem is when he's in the hospital, and Baruch Hashem, he has good news. He was discharged, but now what? It's Friday night. It's 22 hours left to Shabbos. Spending that much time in the hospital is not very exciting. So avada, he can't drive home. Even if it means he's going to miss davening, but you can't be mata Amir La'akam for a mitzvah of davening. The Shulchan Aruch Reish Ayin Vav Si Beis says, although the sheet is bala ita, one of the Rishonim is you're allowed to have a guy do malacha to enable you to do a mitzvah of tefillah or any mitzvah, but we don't paskin that way. And the Shlo is very, very machmer about that. You can't have a guy do a malacha deraisa to enable you to do a mitzvah rabbanan. So if it means staying in the hospital a whole Shabbos and missing tefillah b'tzibur, that's the Ratzon Hashem. Because to call a guy to do malacha deraisa is not justifiable, even if he's going to miss a mitzvah or two. Now, but the question now is, if indeed he has a status of a chayil she'ein b'sakana, and that's really the approach to these shilas is determine the status of the ex-patient that's discharged. I know ex-patient, he's being discharged. So if the person is still shvach, he's still weak. Now the emphasis, the Shulchan Aruch says, if he's chalak, halaguf, and nafal l'mishk, he has to get into bed. But all the poskim say it's lav dafka, he got into bed. Because let's say he's in the hospital and he's very weak, but he can't get into bed. But where's he get into bed? There's no bed. They don't give him a bed. They're discharging him. If he really should be in bed, but he's pushing himself. He can't just jump into a bed now. So let's say this patient is a chayla kol haguf. He's very weak. He can't imagine walking home. It's not shaykh. So here we have our heta. Baruch Hashem, many hospitals are Shabbos friendly, and they know exactly what to do. We say we have to get home now. Okay, don't worry, we'll call the car service. So that is perfectly mutter. The guy is doing an Issa D'Rabbanan, calling a car service, and the car service is doing multiple Isurei Torah, both are mutter for chayil she'ein b'sakana. Now some hospitals have a service that they have a big chayilim has an account, and you go with the car service, they pay for it, and you hopefully don't forget to pay back after Shabbos, of course. Now I want to make a point once and for all that very often we have to go to a hospital, people have to go to a hospital on Shabbos, and we're very nervous about the condition, about Shabbos, but we have to maintain perfect darchei noyam in our relationship with the goyim. We're very nervous and edgy, but you have to say good morning, thank you, please, excuse me. Something the person forgets that there's another human being there. He's so worried about his condition or Shabbos, which is nice. But, like if Salanta once said, he saw a Yid, walked right by him during Elul, and he says, Rabbi Yid, where's your good morning? Because Rebbe said Elul. He goes, Ich darf nicht leiden zu lieb dein Elul. I don't have to suffer because of your Elul. A guy doesn't have to suffer because of our Shabbos. So however we do with the greatest Darchei Noyam, all the times during a hospital, in other words, greeting them, saying hello, good morning, thank you, of course paying, making sure that you pay the outstanding debt, that's at B'Kecholim or the hospital. But basically, this is the klal. If the patient is still an aim by sakana, have a guy call a car service, and the guy could drive the person home, even though he's doing multiple isurei deraisa of havar. And this unfortunately happens very often in a camp or a bungalow colony. Someone is rushed to the hospital. He went al pi halacha. Okay, but now he's discharged. So again, determine the status of the potential chayla. Now, very often a bacha, he fainted. We had this once, and it was okay. He was perfectly okay. So then he would have to remain to the whole Shabbos. The fact that he's missing tefillah b'tziba, that in itself is not a heta. Now, we would like to suggest another possible heta, which is really negaya to many of our cases. Now, let's talk about the case we just mentioned. A bacha was rushed to the hospital, or the chest pain turned into extra cholent. But they're all healthy. But there's another factor which I'm going to bring out from a different child that happens quite often. A muberes thought she's beginning labor, it's going to be the delivery, so she calls the Goyish car service, or she presses the button, the kid says she goes to the hospital thinking now she's going to have a baby. Lamais, it's a false alarm. So she's in the hospital, and typically, as we'll soon see, the Chazanish encourage the husband to go along for the childbirth. And now you have two healthy people in a hospital, someplace in a hick town, very much not Shabbos friendly, not user friendly. There's no B'Kecholim there. Now what? So Zok Tishrag Hamer Chelik Dalet Sim Lamed. What do you mean? Now what? You'll make the best of it. You'll go for a walk. You'll keep busy, but there's no heta. Wait. So one second. So that's clear. If they need food, so you're allowed to have a guy bring food, especially if it's from a local. If it can be from a local place that you don't even have to drive. If there's no food, you have to bring food. I'm talking about they could manage, but it's not going to be like in our neighborhoods with thanks to this wonderful B'Kecholim, it's mamish, you don't know you're in a hospital. So Rabbi Shlomo Zalman in Shulchan Shloima Siman Shin Lamid Ha'ara Dal, it's page Reis Beis, he wants to say a chiddush that regeya specifically for yoledes, and he says that the zman of leida is nikva min hashemayim, but you don't need the pressure of being in a hospital 20 hours because that might induce labor. So he wants to say that if you stay there too long, it's not good for anybody. That might aggravate her condition. So for that alone, he's mata to drive home with the guy and treat her like a chayla she'ein by sakana. Because being there, again, will aggravate her, and that might induce labor prematurely. Now, this is what he wants to say in the Rabelski, the Shulchan Shloim, the end of Shulchan Halev, end of Perik Yud. He says, b'derech klal, without this, he just says that a yoledes, a muberes in the 9th month, especially she rushed to the hospital, is often a chayla she'ein by sakana as it is. He says that it's not different than any chayla she'ein by sakana. So basically, the klal here is on a false alarm regarding labor. If it's imminent, the doctor says not now, but it's imminent, so why go home and come back? But if the doctor says it's a false alarm and it could be any day this week, then we have what to be saimechan, that it's at least a chayla she'ein by sakana. Like Rabbi Zalman said, it might become a chayla she'ein by sakana, and basically they can have the same procedure, have the guy call the Goyish car service, they'll pay for it, and he'll go home. Now, there's another fact I want to mention, and that is basically some Rabbanim are very concerned about a healthy person being in a hospital. Now, I don't mean to be sarcastic, but a hospital is not a place for people to be. Healthy people or sick people, there's a lot of germs, there's a lot of contagious illnesses. Someone told me, I'm not going to tell you the number that he heard of healthy people that get sick in hospitals, being there exposed to germs. So we have to hope that it's a good shliach. But there's another fact to get people out of the hospital as soon as possible because of the potential, health hazards in a hospital. So here we have one yisoid that a yoledes is, we could say, is often treated as an aim by sakana. Once it comes to that status, then the guy could be called to bring them home. But there's another heta that might apply even to the bacher that was rushed to the hospital, the person that overate. And this is a big sugya. Bez Hashem, one day will be a share for itself. But basically we have to know for this sugya as well. And this is a few places in Shas, in a few different scenarios, where Chazal Mata was referred to as Heitiru Seifa Mishum Tchilasa. To make a very long story short, someone went on a mission to a mitzvah, either to fight against the enemy, or to help a woman have a baby. And let's watch the following case. Someone accompanied a patient to go to the hospital. The patient's very scared. It could be an older person, and he can't just put him in a costume and go to the hospital. So he volunteered to go on Shabbos, and the patient needs it. Yisuvei daita, the emotional well-being of the patient is being threatened going to the hospital. So he volunteered. He gave up his Shabbos to go to the hospital. Okay. Now the good news is the patient got there, discharged. You're gesund. Okay. So the patient is still sick. There's still ein basakana. A lot of call the guy. How about the escort? Oh, you're perfectly okay. You're not even sick. So you know what it's like? You know, who halach lemanuchais, vaisanu azav lanachais. You know, the patient, ex-patient goes home, and the tzaddik, the volunteer, is stuck on Shabbos. Chazal were very concerned. If that's going to happen, then there won't be a next time. He's not going to volunteer. You know, mali l'tzara azais. You know, it's very nice to do mitzvahs, but look what happened. So in different contexts, one is regarding Kiddush HaChodesh, as you remember, one is regarding wars. There is a concept of a tiru soifa mishum tchilasan. If someone volunteered and he's not going to be accommodated, he's going to have to stay where he is over Shabbos and have nothing of Shabbos, he'll be discouraged from doing that again. Now this is the heta of hitiru soifa mishum tchilasan, but we'll refer to it as tiru soifa. And again, I'll give you one example in Shulchan Aruch Siman Shin Chavtes. If someone goes to save other people from robbers or armies, he's allowed to go back with his weapons. But he won't want to do it again. Now I am aware that case is more of a heta, because there he needs his weapons for the next potential sakana. I am very aware that this is a very big sugi regarding Hatzolah members. Are they allowed to drive back after any call on Shabbos? Is there a heta for themselves to drive back? Some Rabbanim say yes, and that's why some Hatzolah members drive back on their own on Shabbos. Some Rabbanim say no, they should get a guy, and I'll leave that for people that are bigger than I am. But the point is, there is a concept in very real halacha l'mais of a tir seif m'shem tchilasa. Now let me present what I admit is a chiddush, but I did find Heinrich Pais can say this. Let's talk about this fellow who, he has a weakness with cholent and he overate, and he was rushed to the hospital. He was told, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm happy, you're okay. You can't go back home because you're not sick. Sorry, got to stay here. Or the bacha that wasn't feeling well, he rushed to the hospital. He spent the whole Shabbos there, and it was a terrible ordeal. Question. Is it shach to be mad to them to go back? The patients themselves, the ex-patients, in other words, let's say this fellow has another occurrence. The Rav says, listen, I'm not a doctor, but if you have a suffix, you have to go to the hospital. I'm not going. I'm b'shum hoifen. I remember last time, I don't want to say what he rather do, but he's not going to the hospital. That's it. That's a dangerous situation. Now, that's, of course, a reckless decision, a dangerous situation. And he's not going to go. Is it shach to say regarding the ex-patient that he could go back on Shabbos al tatir seif shem tchilasa? And l'chayra hayadvarim kal v'chayma. Madach, you allow a volunteer to go back, so he shouldn't be discouraged from doing a mitzvah the next time, which is nice, but it's only a mitzvah. That's mutter. So if you're going to encourage someone to neglect a safek v'kuach nefesh, that's much worse. And don't forget, there's a mitzvah of helping someone else, and there's a mitzvah of protecting your own life. It's the same mitzvah. There's no difference, yenem or yourself. So why don't we say, regarding the ex-chayla, ex-patient, even if he's a bari, but let's make it a pleasant experience to go to the hospital misafik. Otherwise, the next safik, he won't go, and who knows what could happen. Now, here is interesting, because the Chasam Sofer in a Tshuva and Chayshemish, but Siman Kuf Tzadik Dalet, has a different shayla about a doctor that had to go on Shabbos to heal people, goyim, al darkei shalom. So the Chassam Sofer writes he has to do the mitzvah, do what he has to do, darkei shalom, but he can't come back on Shabbos. Tirun Sofer mishum tchilas, and let's allow him to go back on Shabbos. So the Chassam Sofer, he has to go to treat the goyish patients because otherwise he's in trouble. And if it's a question of him being in trouble if he doesn't go, you're not worrying about next time because he's going to have to go. So the Chassam Sofer's concept is hu yachosh la'atzmai. He has no choice. He must go the next time. So what are you worrying about? But those that volunteer, he'll decide not to volunteer. Oh, so here we see if hu yachosh la'atzmai, there's no heta. However, there's a very simple makom l'chalik. Because there he's a doctor, and if he doesn't go and treat the goyim, he's going to be fined or lose his license, whatever the story is there. But he must go every single time. So he has no brera. But I just told you, this fellow had a scare. He had a harrowing experience. It was much worse being in the hospital the whole Shabbos. Next time, he's not going to go. Right or wrong, he's not going to go. And that's Seifim Shem Tchilasai. So I did not find this in earlier Paiskim, but the Aruch HaShabbos in Chelik Beis, Amud Reish Samachei, says this heta, that if there's a concern that he's going, then the next time he has a scare, he will not treat it properly, he will not respond and not go, that might be a Tirus Seifim Hashem Tchilasai. Rav Sternbuch in Chelik Beis, Kuf Ayin Dalid, adds this as a sniff. It's not the perfect heta, but he adds this with other tzadim to be makel to go back on Shabbos. Now again, our Chassam Sofer, it's very different. Because there he must go, period. Here, next time he won't go. Now the Aruch HaShabbos himself, in page Reish Mem Zayin earlier, who's Mekel, he says, I the Chassam Sofer, he says, but Lamaisa, I did find a Tashbitz, in Reish, and Shulchan Aruch Reish Mem Ches, Siv Dalet quotes this, that a person, if there's a concern that the person will be negligent the next time, there might be this new heta of Seifim Hashem Tchilasai. He says maybe that's like plug, but anyhow, I know it is a chiddush, but it makes sense. It makes sense because we see people are anyhow they procrastinate. It's nothing. I'm not going to go. I'm not going to take care of it. I'm not going to worry. Chas v'shalom, it could be dangerous. Now, the only question is, why this is not in Shulchan Aruch? Why this het's not in Shulchan Aruch? So that could be very pashit. Because the Maisa, this wasn't so common. In those days, they didn't have this going to the hospital and coming on Shabbos back and forth. And they weren't as mefunik as we are. They were happy to be alive. They went to a doctor. And there was no choice of going home, not going home. Maybe that's the cheshbon. I just want to mention this factor. It's logical to say there is a form of Seifim Hashem Tchilasai. Now, basically, when the Rav has to decide if the person has a heter to go back, let's say it's a suffix, if he's a chayil shein by sakana, I think definitely we could add this yisoid, that now besides the possible chayil shein by sakana, we could also say that this is eligible to the hatiru saifan mishum tchilasam. Now, that would be regarding that shayla. Now, so basically the klal number one is, we have to know the condition of the patient. If he's an ein by sakana, he could go back lechatchila. If it's just a question of convenience, he could stay in the hospital. He should stay in the hospital. But if there's a concern of a seifa mishum tchilasai, that might be another tzad to be made. Question, someone asked this, and this is a good part of our sugya because it's an important insight. A woman had a miscarriage. Okay. Now, a miscarriage, halacha, the first 3 days is no different than a leda. So the woman is a chayla sheyesh by sakana. It's interesting. The hospitals they chase out the yoledes after 1 day. It's a wrong attitude because it's the first 3 days yesh by sakana. But anyhow, now here's what was the question. So after she had this miscarriage or after a baby, there's no difference. Lamaisa, they're discharging after a day. But it's Shabbos, and this was not one of the big hospitals, this was a small hospital. They say, you know what, we know you're a Sabbath observer, we'll give you a room for the Sabbath, but insurance does not pay because you're not eligible. You pay out of pocket, you could stay in a hotel room in our hospital, quote unquote. You'll stay in the hospital, we'll treat you like a patient, but you have to pay. Now, they're about to go home because there's a yesh by sakana nachtetzu, but they have an accommodation. Do they have to not go home, pay out of pocket, and be comfortable? Now, we're talking about that the hospital will be at a comfortable accommodation, otherwise you're not gaining. So the truth is, this must be mentioned. The financial consideration is not a cheshbon in our shayla. The Shmir Shabbos in no less than 4 places, Lamed Beis, Lamed Ches, Lamed Vav Ches, Mem Samach Gimel, and Mem Ayin, in 4 different scenarios points out you're allowed to go to a better hospital even though it's further, you're allowed to go to a better doctor even though he's further, and when there's a question of care or treatment, you do what's best. But as he says it emphatically, but not also asoisem mitam kaspiyem greda. There's no heta to save money. Our Zaydas gave up literally their jobs to avoid Chilul Shabbos. So the fact that it's going to cost a few dollars out of pocket is not a het in itself. So basically, don't forget, the Shulchan Aruch, the Ramah, and Yeridei, Kuf Nun Zayin Aleph says a person has to be willing to give up kol mamoyin and not to be oiv on a lav. And the Goyin points out Kedarke very bekitza, even an Issa Rabbanon. You have to be willing to give up kol mamoy not to be oiva. And his rise of a Mishnah. Mishnah says if someone's house is burning down, you can't have a guy. You can tell a guy to put out the fire, even though it's kol mamoy. Right? So again, this yisoid that it's going to cost me something. That's the best spent money, and the halachic Shabbos is definitely worth it. Now, but if it won't be the same care that you get at home, so then you're back to the original shaila. But basically, staying in the hospital, if there's a good accommodation, that should be pursued even if it's costly. Now, here it's interesting because the person said, but his wife is a choilish yesh by sakana. I said, true. For yesh by sakana, the heta is to care for the choila. What he's doing is he's not caring for the choila, he's caring for the few $100. Now, there's no heta to have a guy doing this to the raisa for a few $100. There is a heta, we'll soon see, to have a guy doing this to the rabbanon b'makam hefsid, but not to go to malacha deraisa. So basically, if there is an option that should be employed, and again, even though it's not the level of covered Oynik Shabbos you have at home, but trust me, this is the greatest covered and Oynik Shabbos. It's not called ruining Shabbos, it's called keeping Shabbos. I must mention, and Tein L'chacham V'yech Kamoid, there is a famous chiddush of the Maggid Mishnah. Maggid Mishnah holds that when it comes to a yesh b'sakana, Shabbos is hutra, and even things that are not essential for their well-being is mutter. In other words, he has a big kula in Hilchas Shabbos. Could be, like this Maggid Mishnah, there's more of a tzad to go home, even though there's accommodation in the hospital, because she'll still be better off at home. Now, even though it's not make much of a difference, so like the Maggid Mishnah, there might be a little more room for leniency. The problem is that not all the poskim accept that the Maggid Mishnah is heter. Now, there's another factor that must be considered, and basically when a person runs on emergency, whether it's a later or it's a potential heart attack, so avada, I have to be clear, you're not allowed to leave children alone. That's dangerous. But you leave children with the older sister who's all of 14 years old, and a little bit Saimcha Anes you have to be because it's you have to go to the hospital. But Lamaisa, the situation at home is unknown. Let's put it that way. There's children at home with the older sister. Now, let's say, Baruch Hashem, they were discharged, and now the wife feels good, the husband feels good, but they're thinking about the house and they're getting sick. There's all the kids running around, the 14-year-old. So if a situation that the children need parents at home, they only left them in that situation because they had no other choice. So that we have another heta to have a goy be called, goy shekar service, and go with a car service. Again, the goy will call the goy shekar service. What's the heta? So this is the Shulchan Aruch, we'll soon see in detail. But the Mechaber says, Stam tzorchei koton k'choyle she'ein bei sakana. The needs of a child, if it's pressing needs, as we'll soon see, we treat a child as an ein by sakana. Now, if there are young children at home with older children, and they are, very prone to fighting, whatever it is, but it's not a safe situation for the children at home, so the parents could go home by virtue of their children, because they are tending to the choyim she'ein by sakana, their children at home. Now, if the situation at home is fine, they left it with a married couple, whatever it is, then keep it. But if there's a situation at home that's a tzarachi and gadol, let's put it that way, and maybe when they get home and they see what happens, they'll get sick then. But l'maisa, that's not a reason not to go home. So if you know the situation at home needs parents, so then the at least one of them could go back. Now the question is maybe only one should go, one should stay. So that depends if the wife needs the husband or not. Especially, don't forget, if she's still muberis, she might have to go to hospital later that Shabbos, and then she needs her husband making decisions. So if a situation of an ongoing potential later, then she could go home for the children, and he could accompany her to be with her for later. But again, the safety of young children should never be, forgotten. You have to leave. Of course, chacham eina b'roishai, especially if you know that in the 9th month, have a plan. If you have to go to the hospital, who's going to take care of the children? In fact, the poskim do add, if there's any situation of an emergency and you have to go to the hospital, you're allowed to put the children in the car, stop off by an uncle and aunt, and drop off the kids, because even though the guy is stopping and starting, but this is the needs of a child, is a chayla she'ein by sakana. Now, another point what I want to mention, all the poskim are concerned about it. The question is, how do we apply it, practically? Rabbi Yashiv in Ashrei Ish Lamed Zayin Yud Ches says, although he's makel to go home by a car Geisha car service, he's very concerned about the Chil Hashem factor, the Zilzul Shabbos of a Hamish couple getting out of a car and pulling up to the house and getting out. Now, going to the hospital, the people know you're going with either you're going with a car service, but you're going someplace. It's obvious that you're probably going to the hospital. But as he says, or Moshe also in Aleph Kuf Lamed Beis, he calls a Maris Ayin. The question is, what about Zilzul Shabbos? Here you have a Hamish couple pulling up to the house in Borough Park or Flatbush or Muncie or Lakewood and getting out, and they look fine. So what about the Zilzul Shabbos? Now, so what's the Eitzah? That's the question. So if you live in a Goyish neighborhood and you could get off a block away and walk the house, fine. But, getting off of, Borough Park, where are you supposed to get off? So I saw there's a wonderful sefer, Rafi Neman, on the Yonam of hospitals. He quotes Rav Vozno, who puts it, I think, very well. He says, avoid maris ayin, heicha she'yiyah b'li hezik l'chayla. In other words, if it'll hurt the chayla, you'll make him walk a mile from Harlem to come to his house in Borough Park. What's what he gaining? There has to be a viable option. So if it could get off, let's say people in a suburban area and gets off a little distance from the house, but the Rabbi Yashiv said that therefore don't rely on the het unless you really need it, because again, getting out of a car on Shabbos, pulling up to a house in our neighborhoods is a little of a zilzul Shabbos. Now, next question is regarding the malava, the one that's escorting the patients. So basically, typically, the malava is healthy, and there's no real heta for the malava to go back. Now, are you allowed that when it went in a false alarm, and she came with her husband, so we could say the husband has to go back because there might be another situation that they have to go to the hospital. And the Chazon Ish, the famous letter, and Kuf Malef, and all the person quote is that he urged the husband to accompany his wife, so that would be a heta. But the question is when that's not a factor. So here you have to consider if there's a heta of Seifa Mishon Chilas. Let's say he went with a neighbor, he volunteered, he went with a neighbor that had no one to go with. And he went along, he's a Baal Chesed. And don't forget, Yisuvei Daite is a big factor. Allows people to go with other people. The Mechaber says in Shin Lamed Sif Aleph that if a woman is during childbirth and she's blind, but she insists that you light a candle, you do it even though she doesn't need it. And it's not going to help. Doesn't make a difference. Yisuvei Daite, she has to feel confident. So a person that needs the confidence, he's afraid to go alone, you could go with him. But the question is, going back, if there's a heta of Seif Mashem Tchilasa. So one thing I will say, and this I saw all the poskim seem to agree, that if the husband accompanies his wife to the hospital, let's say it's not on a Yoledis, and a different, a scare. So the wife has a right to go back, but maybe the husband shouldn't go back. I Seifa Mashem Tchilasa, so that they apply the Chsam Seifa. Because he must go anytime his wife needs him. If he values his shalom bayis, he must go. So if it's a husband-wife relationship, he has to go. So that's the Chsam Seifa. So they're talking about a different scenario, but the same idea. Rav Moshe is quoted as saying a husband, if it's not a Yoleda situation, has no heter to go back, and the Shmir Shabbos in Mem Ha'or Kuf Ayin Zayin actually compares it to our Chasam Sofer. And the Kinyan Torah in Chelik Dalet Siman Lametes also says this, that a family member that must go, let's say a son with an elderly parent, if the parent doesn't need the child in the car ride home, if they're worried about going home, then that's part of their job. But if it's just a relative that must go, then there should not be a heter of Seifa Mishum Tchilasam. Now, if Lamaisa we have a volunteer going, then it makes sense that he's allowed to go back if there's a heter if it's a situation of Seifa Mishum Tchilasam. But I want to make another point I think is really very practical. Let's say the patient is going back beheter gomer because he's still shvach. The car is here. And the husband doesn't have a heter Seifa Mishum Tchilasam if it's not a later situation. But he has the following idea. Listen, I'm going to get into the car when the door opens. The guy's not opening it for me. I'm going to the same house you go. We live in the same house. So there's no more malacha being done for me than for you. So the question is a person that has no het on his own to go back, can he jump into the car and get off the same place, get on the same place, no opening doors, nothing. Whatever the choila needs, I'm going to be. Question, is that a het in itself? Now, what's the heter to go into a car? A car is muktzah. So that I once said, Mechaba Ruach HaKodesh. In Shin Ches Siv Beis, Mechaba says a cryptic halacha, a kli afilu hu gadol v'kaved harboy loin isbatel shem kli mimenu loin they godlei v'loin they kvedoi. Even a big, huge keli is still a keli, and there's a heter of klisha malachta le'issa. What's the Mechaba talking about? I don't know, but I think he's talking about a car in our times. A car, as big as it is and as bad as it sounds, is a regular klisha malachta le'issa. You're allowed to move a car. It's not done because we typically can't move cars. But it's a regular klisha malachta le'issa. I remember when I was a child, don't ask me why, there was a great yitzhar to sit in someone's car. And the fellow comes out, get off my car, it's Geneva. So you didn't listen to him. But on Shabbos, he said, oh, get off my car, it's muktzah. Oh, everybody jumped off. The truth is, it is muktzah, but if you're enjoying it, that's a serach gufay. But be that as it may, don't go in someone's car, no matter what it is. But a car is muktzah, but it's malachta le'issa, and serach gufay mekayimai. But the problem is, and this is the big issue, the fact that the yid gets in, his extra weight is causing more combustion, and that's the assumption. And the Har Tzvi and Yeredeya and Reish Tzad Gimel says that initially. More weight is more combustion, is more havaris, 4,000, 8,000 per minute. It's a lot of Chilul Shabbos. But Rav Moshe, in a famous Tshuva Chelik Aleph Kuf Lamed Beis, discusses this very question, and he's not so certain. Ve'eni Yedeya, if there's an Issa Bara, even Midrabanan, to go with someone that has a heter to go with the Goyish car service. Now, again, there's a lot to say, and I don't want to waste our time, but I did do some research. Some people say, what do you mean? In an elevator, you can't get in because your weight causes more electricity, so why is a car different? But that's not a kasha. Adrabah, an elevator is going with electricity, and that needs more electricity per weight. A car works with combustion. I'm not going to try to explain it, but there's a lot of wasted combustion that's not used. And there's an assumption that a small amount of weight, and for a car, a small amount can be 100, 150 pounds, is negligible. It doesn't create new combustion. It uses all the existing one that would not be used depending on speed. I know you didn't follow that, but trust me, it's reasonable to say. Someone told me he saw with his own eyes a report from an ambulance corporation that they said that the weight of an extra person does not cause more combustion. I know it sounds like a chiddush, but this is what the Moshe Safar was about. Now, Lamaisa, the Shmir Shabbos in Perek Mem, Sipem Gipei Gimel, he himself quotes Rav Moshe. He's not sure, maybe there is a problem, but he makes a very logical conclusion. And he says, if a yid is driving the car, beheta, lamashal, the Hatzolah member is going home after his call, and his minig is to go home, drive home himself. To go into the car with him is wrong, because it's potentially the yid, the driver, is doing more malacha. But if the guy is going anyhow, for a beheta, take the ex-patient. To go along, we could rely on these shittas that the yid's presence is not doing any more malacha. But I want to add two beautiful points. Let's say I'm the malava, I have no heta, I want to join with the person I'm going with. Now, when I get into the car and sit down, I didn't do an issa yet, right? Muktzah is not a problem. When does the issa become? When the guy puts on the ignition and steps on the gas and he needs more combustion because of me. But I didn't do any issa, I just sat in the car. That's grama, the guy does more combustion. Or as the Har Tzvi himself says in that same tshuva, he says that basically this adaita de nafshe. If he goes at a lower speed, doesn't need more combustion. He doesn't need more gas. He wants to maintain the same speed for extra weight. Daita de nafshe. So the Har Tzvi who holds that there might be more combustion is makel by a goyish driver. So again, I can't say all agree, but it's reasonable to say that if you could get in and get out, and there's no extra malacha being done, then you could go with someone else. But here, Rabbi Yashiv specifically added, that's okay, but the problem is Zilzul Shabbos. Getting in a car, getting out of a car, so that has to be considered. We should not be mezalzel the halachic Shabbos. It's probably better to stay in the hospital and not rely on this, but if a person feels he's going to stay, he's going to be wiped out, there's a heter to accompany the patient is going beheter. As far as the belongings of the chayla or the malave, so basically the chayla could bring what they need, and they anticipated a hospital stay, and now they're going home before being admitted, then have a whole suitcase of items they don't need. So the klal is you can't have a guy do malacha just for items. It's not pikuach nefesh. So if everything is in an area, if let's say the hospital is enclosed with a fence or whatever it is, there's no carrying, so they can put it in the car, and again that weight is negligible. But if it entails to having a guy carry the items, so then we have a problem, because there's no heter for a guy to carry just to save items. Now if it's a hefsid merubah, and it's a karmelis, it's not a shram deraisa, so it's a shvus, the makam hefsid. But typically, if it's needed at home for the patient, and still a patient, there's still a chayil shem by sakana, that's a hetataka. But it best would be, if possible, you have to work it out, to leave the items in the hospital, of course in a safe place, that you'll find it after Shabbos, and come back after Shabbos. It's a tircha, kedayu Shabbos, that's what Shabbos is all about. Now, if you could be meramis, then I saw Rab Shlomo Miller had a chiddush here, that if you can meramis the guy to carry it, so you're not having really a direct hana from the carrying, the chayfetz is the chayfetz. He was makel based on the Shulchan Aruch Shin Zay and Sif Chav Beis, but clearly, if things could be left in the hospital, that would be a very positive form of Shmir HaShabbos. The real problem, and I don't know much of a heta, is let's say they in the mountains, or in Lakewood or Muncie, and typically, many hospitals are chutz l'tchum, but they went to the hospital emergency. Yeah, they have to go, no matter where it is. Now they were discharged, and the woman, let's say, or the man is a ein by sakana. Fine. What's their heta to go back home? The driving of the guy is okay, but what's your heta, Reb Chayla, to go chutz l'tchum? You'll say, it's only tchum? What do you mean only tchum? Tchum's an issa. Shulchan Aruch and Taf Hey Sif Aleph writes, if a person left the tchum, he can't even go one dollar amis from where he is. Now, the Shulchan Aruch and Taf Zayin Aleph says, if you went b'rshus, b'mitzvah, let's say a midwife went to help deliver a baby, and they left the tchum, so they have alpayim amma l'chol ruach. So that's But to go back home, what's the heta at this point? If assuming that it's chutz l'tchum, wait a second. Chayil she'ein by sakana. We said that the woman or the man is still sick. But here's the problem. Because there's a het of ein by sakana to do an issa d'Rabbanan b'shinui. Well, how is shaykh shinui in this case? Go walk on your head? Drive on your head? How is it shinui to go chutz l'tchum? So it comes out that for the goyish driver to drive me home is okay. But for me to leave the tchum is a very serious problem. Now, the only point here is, and this is an interesting observation, the Chayod in Klal Samach Tes Sif Yud Beis says, let's say a person is ein by sakana, and it's not shaykh shinui. A classic example is taking medication. A chayil is kind of allowed to take medicine, but there's no shinui. What you do? Throw it in the air and catch it in your mouth? It's not shaykh shinui. So the Mishnah Berurah quotes the Chai Adam and Shin Chav Ches Sivkat and Kuv Beis regarding medicine, that if it's not shaykh shinui, he'll do it on a shinui. What could you do? And Rabbi Moshe also says that in a tshuva in Chayla Gimel Nun Gimel. So I saw the Aruch HaShabbos wonders, is that a heta to any and every case of chayil she'ein by sakana? If it's not shaykh shinui, and do it without a shinui. Then we have a heta to go chutz t'tchum, because you can't make a shinui. But he says, and he's certainly right, the Mishnah Berurah does not quote that this chayodam in general hilchas chayla. He and Rav Moshe both say it in one place regarding taking medicine. Taking medicine is an issa kal regarding other malachis d'Rabbanan that are awesome. It's always a notch lower. Maybe only regarding medication is Rav Moshe and the Mishnah Berurah Mekel below shinui. But who said cross the board you're allowed to go chutz t'tchum because it's not shaykh shinui? So I'm going to leave it at that. It's a big tzarachian. Again, that sefer that I mentioned earlier from Reifei Neman, he quotes Rav Vozna. Rav Vozna said that if the chayla, when they went out of Tchum Yud Beis Mil, which even though the Goyin Mishnah Berurah passes only the Rabbanan, but there's a tzaddik called the Raisa, then you can't go back on Shabbos, even if it's ein basakana. Now, the implication is less than Yud Beis Mil, maybe it's mutter, I'm not sure, but he says Rav Vozna told him that if it's chutz to Yud Beis Mil, not to go home for that alone, you can't violate the Issa of Tchumen. So that's something to think about. But he also does add, and that's the Shulchan Aruch in the end of Tav Dalid, regarding Hilchas Tchumim, based on Or Zarua, that if in Makayim of a Tsar Gadol, you could rely on the Or Zarua that says you're allowed to go chutz to Tchum. Now, if the patient in the hospital will be a situation of Tsar Gadol, that might be a legitimate heter. Now, just a few assorted shahs I wanted to mention. A young child that's rushed to the hospital. So typically, Shulchan Aruch Shin Chav Ches Yud Zayin, that stam tzarchei katan k'choyle she'ein by sakana. So the child was discharged, but you're allowed to go home with the child, because to stay in the hospital a whole Shabbos, a young child, is definitely going to have an adverse effect on the child. Now, once the child goes back, beheta, avada, the parents could accompany him. So that would be the heta of stam tzarchei katan. Now, of course, there has to be a legitimate need. The Mishnah Berurah in Reish Ayin Vav Sif Katan Vav, and people misquote this. They say stam tzarchei katan means anything he needs. Mishnah Berurah's lashon is tzrichim harbe. So if a young child is rushed to the hospital and he can't stay there, it's not comfortable, take him home. If it's an older child, and for him it's an experience to stay in the hospital over Shabbos, and he's fine with it, well, let him stay with the parents if it's not going to be a dangerous situation. Question I always wondered about: a son goes with his elderly parent to the hospital. Baruch Hashem was only a scare. So someone told me there's a klal of stam tzarchei zakon, older person, k'chol she'en by sakana. And he said it's an Or Sameach. I said, okay, let me see Or Sameach. So let me tell you what I found. The Or Sameach in the Tshuvas that was reprinted recently in Chelik Beis Chaf Aleph, he declares about a Moshe Zakanim, a nursing home. He says probably some of them, at least, are chalushim, are weak, and they are ein by sakana, and they're like ketanim that tzrachav are chayla she'ein by sakana. Now that's punkt fakir. He does not say stam zakein is a chayla. He says if you have a number of older people, probably some of them are weak. And the Rabbi Yashiv and Ashriya Ish Amit Shinayim Beis was asked, based on their is it a klal, every zakin is considered a chayla by sakana? He says, no. Find out how healthy they are. If they're healthy, gesund hate. But if they're weak, you could say often. But you can't make a klal out of stam tzarchei zakein k'chol she'ein by sakana. But if a zakein is very nervous and worried and it was a traumatic experience, emotional health is also important. So you have to have a fair sense of judgment. What is the status of the elderly parent? If they, in fact, cannot make it a whole Shabbos, go home with them and take them home gesund hate. Kidney stone attack. I told the person that it happened here in Borough Park. They walked to Maimonides, they walked home, and they did the right thing. Because after the attack, that basically felt fine. And this would be a case where Taka walking home would be the Eitzah. Someone told me he had a mild heart attack, Erev Shavuos. That was a Thursday afternoon. And Shabbos morning, he was already discharged, kicked out, literally, out. But the Rav said he's a chayil sheyesh by sakana. It just shows you how the hospital are really mistreating our patients. But the Ma'aseh, that would be mutar, of course, do whatever he needs. He was a chayil sheyesh by sakana. A broken limb, broken foot, broken hand is interesting because that very often is a sakanas aver. Because if the foot or hand doesn't heal properly, he won't have full use of that aver. And the Paiseh, the sakanas aver is lav dafka, he won't be able to use it. But it will inhibit its use. So very often in a broken limb that has to be treated and has to be set, and then you have to go home and rest it, and you can't stay in a hospital lounge and keep the foot in the right position. In a scenario like that, that would be a chayil she'ein by sakana that has sakanas aver, and not only could drive home with a goyish car service, but even chutz l'tchum. Because here, sakanas aver, you could do rabbanan, even biyadayim. As far as Yomtiv, so basically Yomtiv and Shabbos are no different. Hilchas Tchumim is fully in effect on Yomtiv. The only two differences, when applicable, is on Yomtiv you're allowed to carry, so the guy could carry the belongings. And number two, this is interesting, having a guy drive on Yomtiv is not a malacha deraisa ever. Because the whole avara on Yomtiv, shaloi l'tzayrich, is midaraisa muta als mitoich, or als the Rambam Shita, that making an eish chadash on Yomtiv is only the Rabbanan. So the whole driving the car with the thousands of avaras on Yomtiv is only the Rabbanan level. But it's still the Rabbanan. But basically, Yomtiv should be treated like Shabbos. Yomtov Sheini, some are more makel, because the whole refuah on Yomtov Sheini is muta. So maybe there's more of a tzad kula. But I want to tell you one last chiddush. Rav Sternbuch in Beis Kufay and Dal has a shayla where someone was rushed to the hospital the first day of Rosh Hashana, early morning of a 3-day Yomtiv, Thursday, Friday, and Shabbos, and they were fine. So he said a chiddush that they're going to spend 3 days, these Grace Teg, in the hospital. This was when he's still in South Africa. I guess there was no bikkur cholim, there's no Yiddishkeit there. So he said that maybe we're going to consider this as a mitzvah derabim. The mitzvah derabim, you're allowed to have a guy do malacha deraisa. It's not really the rabbim, but it's rabbim and mitzvahs. It's husband and wife, shayfa 2 days, and Sudas Shabbos, and Sudas Yom Tov. So he put that together to make a heta of mitzvah derabim, maybe relying on the balita also a little bit, and then to drive the guy to drive them home. Rabbi, so now is the question that I always find the most difficult, the kasha alai pridaschem. That kasha is always very painful, but this is the last time I'm going to be here till after the summer. So I want to first of all, Haid Lashem Kitay B'Zoich to another year, and I want to thank each and every one of you. Each and every one of you is very much appreciated. Each and every one of you coming. To thank the Beis Medrash that is unfailingly gracious to us. The Achsanya of Simcha Deutsch's devotion is a legend. I thank him very much for all his help. But I guess Achrain Chaviv, that he give a Yeshikayach to Rabbi Elazar Baruch Bald, who continues to be one of the greatest Mabitzei Torah, at the same time being Kulei Masal Hashem U'L'Seirasai. There's nothing in his mind but Harbatzas Torah, not his own considerations, not his own financial survival. I don't know where he's holding now, that part of it, but he's struggling definitely to make sure that the Olam HaTorah could have various shiurim. The Rabbi should give all of these shloisha shutfim, you, the Beis Medrash, and the Misayim, the Gezut Nezuma, Gashmias and Ruchnias, and the next year should be in Shalayim Abnuya. Amen v'amen. Kayach to you.
Well, Kulam Dvigas Akaras Hatov goes to Rav Smith for preparing the shiurim and delivering them each week b'tuv tam b'das. Kayach. Speaking of financial survival, besides Irgend Torah's financial survival, the Beis Medrash main appeal for Bnei Lamor, which includes not just electric, but also the choice of a temporary shul, which are more than a regular Beis Medrash because of the temporary use of the electricity and the fixtures and the tables and chairs, etc. Rabbi the Melachitnik is in the back of Beis Medrash, and whoever could help out, be good, big as a seal for the Beis Shul. After Kaddish, we're supposed to say a sikum of the shir. Kanani ben Akashim and Oskar Baruch Lazakis, as it's sure to figure him to Mitzvah Shenema, Al Nechofis and Mantzika Yagdol Terviyade. Okay, Rabbi said before you're discharged for the summer, we're seeking or being discharged from the hospital.
Good, okay. Okay, what we learned today, Bez Hashem, that the person who went beheta to a hospital does not mean he could go home beheta. It's not a round trip guarantee. Basically, you have to determine the status of the ex-chayla and of the condition that he might find himself. Basically, for chayla she'ein by sakana, then any amir la'akam, even on a severe deraisa or thousands of deraisa, is muta. You don't have to hint, you could ask him directly. For a yid to do an issa, even a derabanan for a chayla she'ein by sakana, is only muta with a shinui. Now, the status of the ex-patient, if he's in good condition and there's a place to stay, he should stay. The fact that he's missing davening or missing a suda with a full oynik Shabbos, that's secondary to halachik Shabbos, kedusha Shabbos. If the chayla she'ein by sakana can't stay, either there's no conditions or it's not good for their health, then you can call a guy, have a guy call a guy. They should be done with dar chinayim and with payment, of course, and they could go home with the guy shikah service. Muberes, that was a false labor, false alarm, typically we could consider it an aim by sakana at least, or other cheshbainis, and they could go back unless they feel that it might be imminent. There's an interesting het of hetira seifim shem tchilasai that perhaps would apply even to a chayla, but it seems for the immediate family that must go, that would not be a heta. If someone has a accommodation in the hospital but they have to pay out of pocket or a nearby hotel, if that's ever shaykh, and that would be a small price to pay for the halachik Shabbos. After birth or a miscarriage is a chayla sheyesh by sakana and should be treated as such. If there's accommodations and it's just as comfortable, that might be an option. A situation that the parents, the rushed to the hospital, one of them needed care, and they were discharged, and they're okay, but children at home need parents, then that's a heta for the parents to go home for the children, and that's stam tzorchei katan k'choyle she'ein by sakana. A malava, if he's needed at home or needed in the car for an older parent or a spouse that needs moral support, that would be also a heta. It's tzarachian, we'll say, if extra weight causes extra combustion, but it seems to be either negligible or it's only a grama. And therefore, to go along with a Yiddish to drive a Hatzolah member is wrong. I saw in a book written, a psakim for Hatzolah, that they should not take stand passengers because he might be doing extra avora. But regarding a guy, we rely on that plus other tzadim that a Yid could accompany someone that's going beheta. The belongings, if it's possible, leave it there. If they need it at home, there's a heta. But basically try to leave it there and in a safe place and pick it up after Shabbos. When someone left chutz l'tchum, to go back chutz l'tchum is a tzarachi and gadol, I would say. Unless there's sakanas eva, but it ain't by sakana, unless it's makam tsar, they should have to stay just by virtue of being chutz l'tchum. There is a concept that when you rush a child to the hospital, tzam tzarachi katan yichol she'ein by sakana, and that would legitimize going home with the child when they're discharged. For an older person, depends on their condition. Kidney stone attack or any scare that basically passes, so you're back to square one. If there's no chayla situation, they should basically stay there. Yomtov is treated like Yomtov Rishon, Yomtov Sheini, some are makel because of refuah there's a tzad heta, and the ikka was, as we said, know the condition of the patient and the condition of the place that we stay. Zuma, I'll see you. Yes, Doctor. Yes.
Why you can't go on the train, Shabbos? So what's that?
So, Rabbi said the summer night shiur must have Bez Hashem next week, July 3rd. Borough Park, Williamsburg, and Flatbush. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday nights. Schedules will be advertised.
What's that? So for cheap is halachos. It's just game to ask.